You're listening to Quorum Radio.
Quorum Radio now on with Joseph McBride, the very Joseph McBride who wrote the book Into the Nightmare, My Search for the Killers of President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippit. Joseph McBride is also, besides being a screenwriter and a man with a very, very extensive list of credits as an author, biographer, and historian, he's also somebody who's an active author. He's about to publish in October the book Billy Wilder, Dancing on the Edge from Columbia University Press. That's coming out in October. Again, that's Billy Wilder, Dancing on the Edge, Columbia University Press. So it's great to have you on Quorum Radio. How are you today, Joseph? How's life in San Francisco and
I'm doing
nearby?
okay, health-wise and work-wise. I've been working really hard and just wrapping up the Billy Wilder book, which he's one of my favorite film directors and writers. He's a great social satirist, and I've been working on that one off and on for about 12 years. I tend to work on more than one project at a time, and I specialize in film biographies, Frank Capra, John Ford, Steven Spielberg, and this is a critical study. And but the Kennedy assassination has been my obsession and avocation since it happened. I was in high school. I was a volunteer on his campaign for his presidential primary in Wisconsin in 1960 and met him 3 times, once when he was president. And so that was a big thrill. And but I actually was so concerned about his safety, seeing him up close, I realized he had no protection. And I wrote a short story for high school freshman English in October 1961 about his assassination, called The Plot Against the Country. I was that concerned about it, and it's kind of an amateurish, very amateurish story, but I had some interesting elements in there about the autopsy and things like that. And it was a plot. I knew it would be a plot, an inside plot. So I was very concerned. So I wasn't completely surprised when he was shot, but it was a shock. A kid told me in the cafeteria line at high school in Milwaukee, and I ran to a radio right away. I've been a journalist since 1960, and I believe in getting to the radio or TV as quickly as possible before the story starts changing. And just to give you just a very brief snippet of why I'm a skeptic of the official story, at 12:40 approximately, I started hearing the network radio reports on a radio at a drugstore, and I listened till 1:30, and I had to get back to class. But all the first reports for 20 minutes said the shots came from the front. They said they're either from the hill in front or the railroad bridge. And then at 1 o'clock, they all started saying, oh, well, the shots came from behind, from this building called the Texas School Book Depository. And they didn't mention they'd been reporting the shots came from the front. And my antennae went up as a journalist. When they change stories without explanation, I always get, it's a red flag for me. And if they had explained it, I might have, been more, amenable to listening to it. But they were just, suddenly reversing the direction of the shots. And as we know, that has a profound effect on the case. And I started watching that evening Oswald being dragged through the halls, and I saw him saying, "I'm just a patsy." And by evening, I was not believing that he was the killer. And his press conference at midnight cemented that for me. So I was a skeptic from day one.
Sure, right. And so, it's fascinating. So this has been an abiding interest for you professionally. I think JFK there's such a cinematic quality about him, and so charismatic, so telegenic. I think it's perfectly sensible that somebody who's so interested in film would be so interested in JFK.
Well, yeah, and interestingly, in 1960, in the Wisconsin campaign, the climax was April 3rd, 1960, was the big rally in Milwaukee. And there was a film being made called Primary, which is now considered a documentary classic of cinema verite. And it's a terrific film about that primary campaign. And it's very handheld cameras and up close and personal. And that rally was the centerpiece of the campaign. And I took a photo of Kennedy, a big close-up of him while he was shaking hands. He signed my wrist, and he signed a name tag. And then I had my Brownie camera, and I blew off the flash bulb in his face, which was incredibly rude. That's why the picture is out of focus. It was 3 feet from his face, and he recoiled, but he he was such a good politician that he quickly smiled and recovered. But I felt really embarrassed at that point. And I think that's why I realized he was so vulnerable. But 4 days before, I'd met him at a little event my mother put on. My mother was an official in the state Democratic Party, and she had a Kids for Kennedy rally where he appeared in front of 100 kids and their mothers. And I got to talk to him there. It was very casual. He arrived with only an aide and a photographer and a one reporter, and that's it, and no security. And so I was conscious of his lack of security, and so that's what fed into my thing. But the point about primary is that moment, I think April 3rd, and it's not an exaggeration to say that's the moment when politics and show business in America merged. He was treated like a rock star. And he was this guy from Massachusetts, an outsider, came in and defeated the favorite son, Humphrey. And Kennedy was like a rock star. And in that scene in primary, 3,000 people screaming and yelling, and, girls giving him the googly eyes and everything. And that's when politics became show business, for better or worse. And
Great. So then you had this really deep personal connection with JFK.
yeah.
And you immediately saw, you kind of smelled a rat.
Yeah, I smelled a rat in the assassination, and I was following the events very carefully. And I went to the newsstand on Tuesday to get the Zapruder film issue of Life magazine and studied that. And but we were being given a lot of media propaganda about a lone gunman. I didn't believe that, but I was being confused by the media, like we all were. And when the Warren report came out, I was, persuaded by it. I was only, like 17, and I kind of was fooled by it. But by 1966, I was a skeptic again. I wrote a letter to a local paper and saying, I really don't know what I think of this case. At least I'd reached that point. As Socrates said, all I know is that I know nothing. That's the beginning of wisdom. I was persuaded in 66, a bunch of books came out by Mark Lane and Edward J. Epstein and other people questioning the official story. And the media were starting to wake up from their torpor and starting to take seriously some of the questions. So I was beginning to rethink it. And ever since then, I've been a student and skeptic of the case, and I've read books about it. And I began doing serious research into my book in 1982 is when I really thought, okay, I'm going to write a book about this. So it took 31 years to come out. It was a long, arduous book to write, but I went to Dallas in 83 for the first time and made numerous trips there to interview people and study the terrain, and went to the National Archives a lot to look at documents. Before the internet, you had to go there and, Xerox documents and go to libraries and look at microfilms. It's a amazingly complex case, although in some ways simple, but it's been made complex to some extent by all the obfuscation that's gone on in the media.
Well, let's do this. Let's look at the person of Lee Harvey Oswald. And, many people have said, just as he said, he was a patsy. Some people will raise the issue that, well, he told a lot of, Vincent Bugliosi, may rest in peace. I spoke to him extensively. A while back, I set up a number of interviews on the 50th anniversary, and he was one of the people. And he said he told all these demonstrable lies. I don't know, is that true, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think his book
is it relevant? Maybe it's not relevant.
His book is just a monstrous pile of lies. It's like Gerald Posner's book. Every once in a while, the mainstream media put out a book that's supposed to close the case, which is absurd. Posner's book came out just as they were opening millions of documents for public scrutiny because of the JFK Records Act. And he arrogantly titled his book Case Closed. And it convinced a lot of people in the mainstream media who have lied to us from the beginning, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other, the TV networks. A lot of them are CIA connected. That's part of the problem. And but, to give the American public their due, consistently, as the Gallup, a Gallup official said a few years ago, consistently about 70% of the people don't believe the official version, which is a good sign of intelligence in the American public. And I think the Kennedy assassination was the beginning of distrust in the government. Usually they say it was the Vietnam War, but the Kennedy assassination was really the beginning when people started thinking, well, the government is not telling the truth to us. And then we experienced Watergate and Iran-Contra and all kinds of other things. And we finally reached the point of Donald Trump, who lied all the time, and George W. Bush lied all the time, you know. And so people, it's caused this split in our country, which is a very serious problem, that half the people believe one thing and half believe another. And it's a, you know, a major problem in our country that people believe the most outlandish things. And people like me, who are considered conspiracy theorists, which is used as a pejorative, are attacked as, you know, the CIA in 1967 put out a memo saying how to attack conspiracy theorists. And they're the ones who popularized that phrase. And they said, try to make them seem like crazy and obsessed and wedded to theories that don't make sense, and they're mercenary and all these things that aren't really true. But in fact, say a movie like JFK, which was attacked as being falsified, actually was quite accurate in terms of its depiction of events. What's false is the picture of events we've been given by the New York Times and the Washington Post and a lot of other media and the TV networks. But I also decided, one thing I decided when I was studying the Kennedy case, how do you write a book about this? There have been so many books. Penn Jones Jr. was a great Texas newspaper man, a maverick editor, publisher of a little paper outside Dallas, Midlothian Mirror. And he's the kind of guy that I really relate to as an old newspaper guy myself. I met him in 1983. He used to lead the ceremony informally on the grassy knoll at 12:30 on the 22nd of November. And I went up to him and I immediately became friends with him. And he said to me and other researchers, take one aspect of the case, something that hasn't been covered enough, and research the hell out of it. And I took that to heart. And the aspect I kept thinking the Tippit murder was the aspect that has been really uncovered, you know. And as a journalist, one thing I've always sensed is when they don't cover a story correctly and they leave a lot of questions hanging, there's something there that, you know, we should look into. And the murder of Officer J.D. Tippit, which happened about 39 minutes after Kennedy was shot, and was also attributed falsely to Oswald. Oswald didn't shoot either one. I thought was the big lacuna in the case. And David Bellin, who is one of the Warren Commission advocates, one of the junior counsel, said it was the Rosetta Stone of the case. And he meant that it proved somehow that Oswald had killed Kennedy, which is backward logic. Part of their logic was, oh, if he killed a Dallas policeman shortly after the assassination, he had to have killed the president, which makes no sense, really, when you think about it. There could be other reasons why somebody would kill a policeman, and it could have been unrelated. And in fact, he didn't do it. But that's pretty absurd proof. But my feeling, it is the Rosetta Stone of the case, because it opens up a lot of windows into why Kennedy was killed, how he was killed, the complicity of the Dallas police, et cetera. And the fact that it wasn't really investigated by the police or the FBI or the Warren Commission. The House Select Committee did some investigation, but not enough. So when I came along, I thought this has never been investigated properly. So I'll do my own, you know.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess you could say that it seemed like it was almost maybe an afterthought for the Warren Commission.
Yeah, I found a document when I was going through the stuff at the National Archive. There's a woman named Alfreda Scobie, who was one of the junior counsel, who was one of the better ones. And she was a protege of Richard Russell, who was a skeptical member of the Warren Commission. And she was there to represent his interests. And she wrote a memo in spring of '64 and said, you know, we haven't looked into the Tippit murder. We really ought to do that. You know, this is pretty important, you know.
And by the way, they weren't about to do that, were they? They were just kind of saying that's another.
Well, they just assumed
that's for Dallas police to check out.
They just assumed that Oswald did it. You know, they threw it in there, and then the J. Lee Rankin, who is the administrative head of the Warren Commission, assigned people to do a little research, and they had the FBI. They said, please do a background check on Tippit. And they did a 19-page report, which was interesting, where they interviewed family members and they got some basic data, but it wasn't very revealing. And that's about all they did, really, frankly. And they never interviewed Mrs. Tippit under oath, for example, and they didn't even go and send an investigator to see her. And it was swept under the rug, as was the Dallas police investigation. Was disgraceful because they dropped the case basically after Oswald was shot 2 days later. And here's a brother officer gets killed. You would think that at least they would try to solve the crime, but they just relied on this kind of vague notion that he probably did both murders. And one thing I found was an FBI document. He was arraigned only for the murder of Tippit, not for the murder of Kennedy, which is very interesting. And I had some very good interviews with Henry Wade, the district attorney, and Jim Lavelle, who was the lead detective on the Tippit case. He's the tall guy in the white suit who's handcuffed to Oswald when he was shot. But he was the detective in the Tippit case, and he was an interesting guy to interview. And between those two guys, I got them to admit that basically they didn't have a case on Oswald for killing Kennedy. It was so sketchy, to say the least. And so Lavelle told me basically Captain Will Fritz, the head of homicide, told him on the 22nd, make a case against him for killing Tippit, because we don't have a case on him for killing Kennedy. That was the gist of it. And I asked Lavelle, well, what did you have on him for killing Tippit that you didn't have on Kennedy? And he said, well, we had witnesses. And they really didn't have a good witness at all for the Kennedy shooting. But on the Tippit case, it was very strange because there were about 20 people there who saw parts of the incident. And it's like Rashomon, the Japanese classic where people see things from different perspectives. The witness statements are all over the map. Some say that Oswald did it. Some say that two people did it. Some say a heavy-set, stocky, short man did it. Some said the guy who did it got in a car and drove away. I mean, it took me a long time to try to straighten this out. And it seemed like there were two sets of witnesses. And Jerry Rose, we build on the shoulders of other researchers. There's a guy named Jerry Rose, had a newsletter, and he wrote a very interesting piece, I think around 1990, postulating that there were two sets of witnesses, and Jack Ruby had helped stage the event in his capacity as a conspirator, which he was trying to tell the Warren Commission that he was a conspirator and they wouldn't listen to him. But a lot of the Tippit witnesses knew Jack Ruby or had some connection to him. And they were there certain witnesses were there to say certain things. And also some of the people who said Oswald did it didn't say it right away. They said it weeks later or months later or even years later. Like Domingo Benavides was the closest witness. He was a guy in a truck right across the street, 15 feet away. And he heard the shooting and pulled his truck over, and he looked out the window and saw the policeman falling, and he ducked over, to protect himself. And he told the police when they asked him, he couldn't identify the witness. They didn't take him in for the lineup, which is ridiculous. Here's the closest witness. They took in other people who they thought would identify Oswald, or some of the people had seen Oswald on TV. The lineups were corrupted. But Benavides finally identified Oswald 2 or 3 years later because his brother was shot to death in a Dallas bar. His brother looked like Domingo. And so this apparently put the fear of God into Benavides. And he said, yeah, okay. He told CBS Oswald did it, But you can't put much credence on somebody who tells a story 3 years later. There was another guy, Warren Reynolds, who saw the man running. There were two men really involved in shooting Tippit, but one of them was running. And Reynolds saw him and he wouldn't identify him as as Oswald. And in January, Reynolds told this to the FBI. He said, I can't identify Oswald as a shooter. And 2 days later, somebody broke into his used car lot that he worked at night. They broke into his office and shot him in the head. And fortunately, he survived. almost a miracle. But he then changed his mind and said, yeah, it was Oswald. You know, I mean, that's not very good witness testimony. But there were people like Aquila Clemens, who was a great witness. She was a African-American lady who was working as a domestic on the next block. She heard the shooting. She didn't see the actual shooting, but she came out and saw the immediate aftermath. And she said she saw two men running in different directions. One of them signaled the other go on, a kind of go on signal, and they broke up and went off in different directions. She said neither one looked like Oswald. One was kind of short and chunky, she said, and the other was tall and skinny. Neither one really resembled Oswald, and they had different clothing. And she was harassed, and the Dallas police came to her shortly after the assassination and threatened her life and said, you know, you could be killed if you talk. But she very bravely talked, and I dedicate the book to her and other witnesses. The only heroes in this case are the civilian witnesses who came forward and told the truth. And she and a couple of other people I dedicate the book to. And she disappeared. She gave some interviews. The last one she gave was to Mark Lane and Emile D'Antonio in the film Rush to Judgment, which I recommend to people. It's the 1966 documentary version of Mark Lane's book of that title. And Mrs. Clemens gives a very brave interview. You imagine a black woman in Dallas in the 60s when it was very bigoted. And she's telling the truth. And she was never seen again after that interview. Nobody knows what happened to her.
Interesting to do a search on her. Did she have any children?
Yeah, well, she had a son who said he was talking about how she was threatened, and he said he had a gun to protect her and stuff. And but people have searched for her in the records. The closest I could find, she may have moved to Philadelphia at some point, but I found the uncut transcript of the interview that she did with Mark Lane. And she talks about her age. If she were alive today, she'd be something like 108. So she's probably long dead. But I hope she wasn't killed. But she disappeared from view after that interview.
Yeah, sure. So tell us about what's your take on Oswald, who he was. Such an unusual person.
He's a fascinating character. I mean, amazing what he did by the age of 24 when most of us are still futzing around. This guy had been to Russia and he was a spy. I mean, I think he's still somewhat mysterious, but people have written some good books on him. John Newman wrote a good book called Oswald and the CIA. And John Armstrong wrote a really fascinating book called Harvey and Lee, How the CIA Framed Oswald. And he put forth the controversial theory that there were two Oswalds. And there was a book with that thesis back in '66 by Richard Popkin, who was a philosophy professor, who noted the many instances in the Warren volumes that showed that Oswald seemed to have been in two places at once, which they kind of dismissed as kind of, okay, witnesses were confused, blah, blah, blah. But Armstrong did tremendous research for 10 years. I mean, the guy really covered every base. And you can really, as I found in my Capra research, there's a tremendous paper trail on all of us. Some of the paper trail on Oswald has been classified, though, and it's only come out recently. But for example, I'll just give you a couple of examples. Oswald, the morning after the assassination, I was a skeptic for a long time that there were two Oswalds. It seemed very strange. And if we had been told that on November 22nd, we would have thought that was insane. But the day after the assassination, at 9:30 in the morning, a junior high school principal in Fort Worth got a phone call from the FBI and said, we want to come to your office right away and look at your records on Lee Oswald. So he said, okay. And then they arrived at 10 o'clock and he opened up his files and he found Oswald's records. He had attended this junior high in Fort Worth, and they confiscated the records and then they disappeared. The records have never been seen again. But what makes it interesting is that according to the official record that you read in the Warren report, Oswald was attending junior high in New Orleans at that time. There are records on both schools, so what's going on? There are two guys using that identity. It is actually not that uncommon in spycraft for a spy to have a name to be used by different spies. Maybe even as many as 5 spies use the same name. One reason they do that is plausible deniability, that if Joe Blow does something criminal in Miami, you could say, well, he didn't do it because he was in Dayton, Ohio at the time, you know, and you could prove that he's in Dayton, Ohio. It confuses people. So I think that was it. But Armstrong has a complicated theory about how they sort of groomed two boys to be spies with different identities. And Marguerite Oswald, Oswald's mother, apparently there were two women with that identity too. And obviously they weren't planning the Kennedy assassination in the 50s, but they were planning him for something, some use, you know, they planned people for use. And he was a false defector to Russia. And that's pretty clear. He went there at the behest of our government to be a spy. And the Russians were very shrewd, and they realized they didn't trust this guy, and they had him under surveillance. And then he came back to the US under peculiar circumstances where he suddenly showed up and said, I want to go back to the US, and they let him come right back. And normally they wouldn't do that if he was a bona fide defector, you know, and they paid his way to come back. And, you know, he was a CIA project, but I believe at the time of the assassination, he was working also for the FBI as an informant for their Dallas office. And he had infiltrated the plot against Kennedy, which was in the works for at least several weeks, actively in the works, because there was a plot to kill Kennedy in Chicago on November 2nd that was aborted at the last minute by a tip from an informant named Lee. And then Kennedy was possibly going to be shot in Tampa, and then Miami, and then Dallas. And there were a lot of warnings blinking red that they ignored. And Oswald, I believe, was passing along information to the FBI in Dallas. And I found records, the FBI admitted after it came out in a hearing in the 70s that Oswald had arrived at the Dallas FBI office around November 10th or 12th with a note. They claim it was a threatening note. He said he would blow up their office if they didn't stop harassing his wife. But the note was destroyed on November 25th after he was shot. I'm sorry, 24th. So we don't know. All we have is the word of the secretary. But I found two other instances in November in which Oswald conferred with the FBI, which is remarkable, 3 times in 1 month at least. Like the morning he was shot, the Dallas paper said that Oswald had been at the FBI office, I think it was November 16th. What was he telling them? You know, I think he was telling them about the progress of the plot. And then he didn't realize he was being set up as the patsy in the plot. And then he finally, after the shooting, he realized it, and he fled to Oak Cliff, and he was pursued by Tippet and another officer named William Menzel. That's one of my major revelations I found, was that, and some people speculated this as early as 63, 64, but it was kind of stifled by the media and the FBI, that what was Tippet doing? Was he just a cop who just kind of was rolling down a street and was, you know, ran into this fleeing gunman? No, he was, and I interviewed his father, who told me that Marie Tippet, the widow of the officer, told him after the shooting that a policeman had visited her and said he and JD had been assigned right after the assassination to track down Lee Oswald in Oak Cliff, where he lived. They knew that he'd be heading back to his rooming house. They had him under surveillance. They knew who he was. The Dallas police knew who he was, contrary to what they claim. And so this, at least by 12:45, 15 minutes after the assassination, these two policemen were tracking Oswald in Oak Cliff. And according to Mrs. Tippet, the other policeman, Menzel, who was the guy assigned to cover the district, Tippet was out of his district. Menzel said, I got into a car accident and JD got there in time and he got killed. And so I checked the record. There was a car accident 2 blocks away within 2 minutes of the shooting. And Menzel was the officer sent to according to the records, he was sent to investigate the accident. And he cleared the accident after 4 minutes, which is peculiar in itself. If you're going to show up at a car accident, you can't take all the information in 4 minutes and get out of there, you know. So my feeling is that he may have had the accident, as he told Mrs. Tippet, and he didn't get there and he felt bad about it. And JD drove into an ambush is my feeling. I could elaborate on that, but you have a question.
We look at Oswald we see the grinding poverty that he and Marina lived in. And so I look at this whole thing about, was Oswald, an intelligence asset? If he were, gosh, you would have thought that they would have taken better care of him financially.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You got to wonder, they were living pretty
Hand
frugally,
him out.
although she was being taken care of by Mrs. Ruth Payne, and Irving in a nice ranch house, not lavish, but a comfortable house. And she was conveniently, Mrs. Payne conveniently separated from her husband, who worked for Bell Helicopter, and he had a security clearance. And Mrs. Payne was probably the CIA babysitter for Marina Oswald. And most of what Lee Oswald called the so-called evidence, he used that phrase to his brother when he came to visit him in jail. He said, "Don't believe all this so-called evidence." Most of it came from the Payne home. Mrs. Payne and Marina were constantly producing pieces of evidence from the home that implicated him. And Marina, according to James Hosty, who was the FBI agent assigned to the Oswalds before the assassination, he writes in his book that he thought Marina was of more interest to him because he thought she was a KGB plant, possibly, that she was sent. It's peculiar. Here's a guy in America, an American in Russia, and he finds this attractive Russian woman at a dance, and they marry 2 weeks later, and then they go to America. And that's a typical way that Russians would send agents to the US. And she'd been involved. It came out with another defector called William Webster before that. And so this could be what they call a honey trap operation in intelligence, where they have an attractive woman seducing a guy, and she got into the US. So Hosty thought she might be KGB, and she had an uncle who was in the Russian intelligence services. So my feeling is what happened to her was Mrs. Payne was CIA, and when Marina realized her husband had been caught and accused of the assassination, she turned and became a fervent supporter of the American government's position that he was the assassin, out of self-protection, because they were threatening to deport her and God knows what else, And so she started blaming him. And then in later years, she started turning and saying he didn't do it and all that. And so she's still alive, but her position has changed so much, we don't really know. She's not a very credible witness anymore, but she was under tremendous pressure. But she and Mrs. Payne produced a lot of the evidence, and we kind of got off your topic. Oh, yeah, the poverty of Oswald. Yeah, he didn't make much money, but we don't know because his income tax records are still classified. Marina could release them under U.S. law. That's one thing that can't be released under the JFK Records Act without a family approval. And she won't release his tax records for 62 and I think 63. And maybe he had some other sources of money. And he worked in some interesting jobs. He worked for a company called Jaggers Child Stovall, which did classified intelligence photographic work for the government. Why would a Russian defector be allowed to work at a company like that? So he sure lived frugally, but he was a kind of an ascetic guy. He didn't seem terribly motivated by money. And yet he wasn't a real ideologue either. He was kind of a mysterious character. I think he was a patriotic American who was trying to serve his country. He was a Marine, and he was a false defector on behalf of the CIA, and then he was an FBI informant. And, I think he was motivated by patriotism.
Well, you look at Nelson Delgado disclosing that Oswald spoke constantly about helping Fidel and going to the mountains to fight for Fidel.
Well, those were stories they put out to try to, there've been a lot of people have written about how the Joint Chiefs of Staff blame Kennedy for supposedly failing to follow through in the Bay of Pigs, and then he, to invade Cuba with full force. He didn't do that. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis, he made a deal with Khrushchev and agreed not to invade Cuba. And this infuriated the Joint Chiefs, and this could be one of the reasons Kennedy was assassinated. as well as his decision to start pulling out of Vietnam. They thought he was a traitor. And there's a lot of evidence of this, that the Joint Chiefs were very hawkish and they wanted to invade Cuba. So the cover story that was put out quickly the day of the assassination with suspicious quickness was that Oswald was a Castro supporter, but in fact, he was the opposite, it seemed. I mean, he was playing both sides of the fence. And but they wanted to paint him as a communist Castro supporter to either make it look like Castro was behind the assassination or Khrushchev. And it was a motive to, okay, let's invade Cuba to avenge Kennedy's assassination. And people have speculated that Johnson initiated what Peter Dale Scott, the historian, calls phase 2 of the cover-up, which is phase 1 would be he's a communist, let's invade Cuba, and maybe Russia. After that, the Joint Chiefs wanted to launch a first strike nuclear attack in Russia, which would have destroyed the world.
Is that right?
Yeah, and then they wanted to have a nuclear attack in Cuba, which would have caused a world war. But anyway, phase 2, according to Scott, is, well, let's call him a lone nut without any ideology, a crazy person, to avoid having a war. You know, and Johnson used that line with Earl Warren, for example, when he called him in. And he said, I want you to head this commission. And Warren said, no, I don't want to do that, partly because he thought it was improper for a Supreme Court justice to do that. And also he probably sensed that he didn't want to be involved in something crooked. But Johnson said, you know, 30 or 40 million Americans are going to be killed if we don't quash this story about him and Castro, et cetera. We don't exactly know what he told Warren, but he scared him enough, apparently, to think that we better cover this up or we'll have a big world war, massive war, millions of people will be killed. You know, and that was kind of I mean, I guess you have to give Johnson some credit for avoiding that. Kennedy was being pressured very hard by the Joint Chiefs, and Johnson was as well.
Right. So we look at Oswald going to Mexico City. Gosh,
I don't think he did, though, Bill. I think he didn't go. I think he was impersonated down there.
Really?
That's been a subject of great controversy for a long time. But there was a long report that was suppressed by the House Select Committee for a long time, the Lopez report, where they investigated it very thoroughly. And it, you know, the CIA produced photographs of a guy they said was Oswald at the embassies down there, the Soviet and Cuban embassies. And it wasn't Oswald, it was some middle-aged, stocky, heavyset guy. And then they sent a tape that night to Dallas that they had recorded of Oswald in Mexico City, supposedly, and they played it for the investigators who were interrogating him, and they said it wasn't the same guy. So really, I don't think there's any clear evidence that Oswald was in Mexico City. I think this was part of the setup to make him look like a Castro, maybe Khrushchev sympathizer who's trying to get into Cuba. And he went there to cause a scene, you know, trying to get in, and they wouldn't accept him. And, you know, I think that's a big part of the setup that David Adley Phillips of the CIA probably planned. And his boss was probably James Jesus Angleton of the CIA.
Always looking for a mole.
Yeah, they wanted to establish what they call a legend. And, you know, there are books pro and con this whole theory, but I don't see any clear evidence that Oswald was in Mexico City. Just like John Armstrong proved that Oswald did not own either gun that was introduced into evidence. The Mannlicher Carcano rifle or the pistol that shot Tippit, allegedly, although the police reported at the time it was an automatic pistol, but they produced a revolver in evidence. And even an FBI expert who was honest testified before the Warren Commission that the bullets removed from Tippit could not be matched with the revolver that they said Oswald had used. And Armstrong did exhaustive research. It's very impressive. He has a chapter on each weapon, tracing the provenance of both weapons. And there's no connection you can establish between Oswald and these weapons, which pretty much exonerates Oswald from the case. If he were brought to trial, that would be enough to clear him, along with the fact that there's no credible witness placing him in the window.
Well, okay. First about the bullets that were found in Tippet's body. Supposedly the bullets were, given the markings on it, were consistent with a bullet fired from either a rechambered or, because the whole matter of a bullet that was in a gun that was initially a 38 was chambered to be a 38 special, slightly different in size, affecting the surface of the round because of the fact that gas was escaping around it, and it had a certain unevenness about regarding the grooves. I mean, isn't it possible that it actually could be consistent with that revolver?
Well,
The special
yeah, I mean,
modified
I could
revolver.
tell you've studied it, but the FBI expert, if you read his testimony, Cortland Cunningham was his name,
Yeah.
testified that while there were some unusual grooves and markings and stuff, he couldn't connect them with the bullets. He just couldn't connect them conclusively with the bullets. The bullets were quite damaged that were extracted from Tippit, and some of the bullets, one or more of the bullets that hit Tippit may have been not entered into evidence. And another problem with the evidence, like one bullet was supposed to have fallen out in the ambulance that never appeared later. And then another problem was the Dallas police sent a lot of evidence to the FBI right after the assassination by airplane. They didn't include the Tippit bullets. And the Warren Commission, quite some time later, weeks later, said, "Where are the Tippit bullets?" And the Dallas police said, "Oh, yeah, we have them in a locker somewhere," and they produced these bullets. That's not good police procedure to come up with bullets weeks later, months later, whatever it was.
Sure.
Those could have been planted, and they probably were. And then they weren't marked properly by the policemen on the scene. And then there were different accounts of who found them, and all kinds of problems with the collection of the evidence. But this FBI expert studied all the things you mentioned and concluded that unfortunately he could not link the bullets to the gun.
And the hulls, the shells from that were found, Domingo Benavides, the Davis
Well, yeah,
was found.
Benavides claimed he found some shells and he put them in a cigarette pack. And then there was a young woman at the corner who claimed to have found some, forget if it was shells. I think it was shells in her shrubbery. But they weren't, part of the problem too, there were two different kinds of ammunition, which is kind of hard to explain. It might suggest two different guns.
Well, two different kinds or two different brands?
Two different brands of, manufacturers of ammunition. And the shells don't match the bullets either. It's all very confused. It is consistent with stuff being planted very clumsily. Just like his wallet, there were like 5 wallets that were attributed to Oswald, and there was a wallet that was apparently planted at the scene of the Tippit murder. They were planting evidence, as police have been known to do, to enhance cases, planning stuff. And there was a policeman there, Westbrook, who was head of personnel, and you wonder why the head of personnel was there. Pinky Westbrook was his name. And he may have been there to plant certain evidence, and he's been implicated by some people. One thing when you write a book, you hope that other researchers will go beyond it, because I was trying to sort of jumpstart the Tippit side of the case because it had been dormant for a long time. And John Armstrong and other people have gone into other areas, and they've implicated Captain Westbrook and a guy named Kenneth Croy, who is a policeman. They think that they may have been the shooters. And I thought that there was a police car in the alleyway. Tippit pulled up in an alleyway between 2 homes, which is interesting. And there was a police car spotted by a couple of witnesses in the alleyway. And then it backed off, and witnesses said they saw somebody come out of the police car and shoot Tippit, and then go closer to him and shoot him in the head as a coup de grace. And
you're saying some witnesses were seen supposedly? I'm sorry. There were some witnesses that supposedly saw A policeman shoot Tippit, you're saying?
Yeah. Well, the guy who was the shooter was apparently not dressed as a policeman, but he went back into a police car. There was a police car sitting in the alleyway, and there was a policeman in the car, and then this shooter went back into the car, and then the car backed off into the alley. The alley went all the way to Jefferson Boulevard, the major drag there, which was about 2 blocks away. And so that's what I think happened. It was a police ambush that they killed Tippit. And I'm glad that people have gone beyond my research and fingered. One of the things that's strange about the case was the Davis sisters, who lived at the corner, heard the shooting, and they came out and they said there were policemen there right away. And that's not the official story. The official story was it took several minutes for policemen to get there. And but they said there were policemen on the scene right away. That's another indication that something fishy was going on. And Croy was apparently the first policeman there, and he was a reserve officer. And his whereabouts were fishy because he claimed he was having lunch at a coffee shop, and then he said he went to see his wife at Austin's Barbecue, which is a place where a lot of right-wingers hung out. You know, it's kind of fishy stories. And Menzel was also claiming he was having lunch at the time. You know, a lot of cover stories were going on. So it was a police ambush. And then you have to ask yourself, why did Tippit drive into a police ambush? What was that all about? And then it enters the realm of speculation that they knew who Oswald was. They wanted to get him. They either wanted to kill him or capture him. And I think kill him was probably the goal, because if they had killed Oswald on the street within 15 or 30 minutes of the assassination, it would have looked like great police work. They solved the whole case, you know. But they failed to kill him, and then they captured him in the theater, and there was evidence they were trying to kill him in the theater, and they failed to do that because he was shouting, "I am not resisting arrest, I'm not resisting arrest," and there were some civilians there. So they dragged him into a police car and took him downtown. So they failed to kill him, and then so 2 days later, they had to let Jack Ruby into the police station to kill him.
So you think that the Ruby murder, I mean, the Oswald's murder was all part of a setup whereby
Yeah.
he was going to be silenced, right? Which I've seen, by the way.
Ruby was
in Colombia, that happens. But I have a question. That is that, you know, if Jack Ruby had been contracted by the police, or the police had arranged to have Ruby rub out Oswald, I mean, don't you think they could have picked a better person from the standpoint of somebody who had discretion, somebody who was low key and could kind of fly under the radar? And that was not Jack Ruby. Jack
well,
Ruby
that's
could
one way to
not
look
fly
at
under
it.
the radar.
Another way to look at it would be that he was a perfect guy because he was a police character, as they called him, and he knew everybody in the police force, or at least hundreds of them. And he had easy access to the police station. Somebody let him in, you know, and he's the kind of guy they could explain, well, he was around a lot, and he was, you know, but he wasn't like a sort of professional killer from Chicago they sent in. And they tried to make it look like he was a crazy person who killed Kennedy because of some emotional need to prevent Mrs. Kennedy from coming to Dallas for a trial, which was just a fabricated excuse. But he tried to tell Earl Warren. There's a book called The Yankee and Cowboy War by Carl Oglesby that's really good. And he dissects and analyzes Ruby's testimony before the Warren Commission, which was done in the Dallas County Jail, which was a very tough place for Ruby to talk because he felt his life was in danger. And Earl Warren and Gerald Ford came to interview him. And Ruby was trying to tell Gerald Ford desperately, and Warren, take me to Washington and I can talk freely, and they wouldn't do it. And then he dropped all kinds of hints that I can tell you all kinds of things, and I was involved in all kinds of stuff. And he broadly hinted he was involved in the whole plot. And Warren kind of assumed indifference. And Ruby said, you don't know the setup down here, do you? You know, like, you know, it was like they were talking across purposes, but Warren knew more than he was saying. And so Ruby was apparently involved in helping stage the Tippit murder. A lot of the witnesses were connected with him. They had either worked with him or they were friends of his, or they were like the waitress, Helen Markham, who was the main witness who the Warren Commission relied on to say that Oswald shot Tippit. But she was a terrible witness because she was kind of hysterical and kept changing her story. But she was a waitress Ruby knew because he would go into her diner restaurant almost every night. And a couple of the witnesses knew Ruby, but they gave contradictory stories. Like I interviewed T.F. Boley, who
Oh yeah, he knew.
He had worked as a bouncer for Ruby, which he didn't tell me when I interviewed him. He told me he had never been interviewed except by the FBI, I guess, and the police, but no researcher had ever interviewed this man. He was very forthcoming. But the one thing he didn't tell me was he had worked for Jack Ruby, but he admitted he knew him. I mean, most people in Dallas, a lot of people had gone to his clubs, especially if you were a young man, go to these strip clubs or whatever. But Boley arrived at 1:10, and he said he looked at his watch. He's the only witness who looked at his watch. He pulled up right after the shooting, and he was driving with his daughter. He was on the way to pick up his wife for a vacation. And that kind of demolishes the Warren timing, because they claim the shooting took place at 1:15 or 1:16. Oswald was seen at his rooming house at 1:04, and that was 9/10 of a mile away. So to get there by 1:09 when Tippit was probably shot, or 1:10, would have been almost impossible unless you were running very fast, and nobody reported Oswald running fast. And so they had to stretch out the time to 1:15 or 1:16. And even the documents, like at the Methodist Hospital, Tippit's death certificate was, they changed the time of his death and things like that. So they lied about when he died, and it was either 1:08 or 1:09 that he was shot. At 1:08, he was trying to make a call to the police dispatcher, and he couldn't get them, and probably shot right around that time. So Boley arrives at 1:10, which is inconvenient for the Warren Commission, so they never called him as a witness. But he was working for Ruby, so he gave damaging testimony against the official version, to me anyway.
He's just curious, by the way, is he? So I imagine he's deceased by now, right?
I don't know if he's deceased. A few years ago, they gave him a medal in Dallas for being a good citizen. He was the guy who called in the shooting on the police radio because Benavides didn't know how to work the radio and he was having trouble. And Boley was a radio technician, and he picked up the radio and he was able to call in the shooting report. They gave him a medal. I'm not sure if he's still alive or not, actually. He was a nice man.
Yeah. Interesting that you tracked him down.
Yeah.
That's good footwork.
I spent a lot of time in Dallas, and it was hard to find a lot of people, but he was easy. I just found him in the phone book and called him. He said, come on over. And I mean, that was kind of what was weird about the case, was he said, nobody's ever called me before,
Yeah, I'm amazed about that.
Yeah. Well, there are people like that, and there are still people around. Like, you could get Ruth Payne is in the phone book. You could call her up and see if she'll talk to you. I went to a talk she gave in Santa Rosa because she lives there, and that's near where I live. And she said, I'll talk to people on the phone, but she said, I always ask them, what do you think of the letter that I found? Oswald allegedly wrote a handwritten letter to Marina saying what she should do if he were arrested, right? And this
related to the supposedly at the night of the Walker incident.
Right, the Walker, they claimed later that he'd taken a shot at General Walker, which is probably not true. But Mrs. Payne found this sometime after the assassination in a book, and she pulled it out and gave it to Dallas police. Very convenient to find this piece of information. And I asked her at this public appearance, they had us put questions in a little box. They wouldn't let us ask her directly, but the question I had was, how come you kept finding evidence that the Dallas police and the sheriff's department didn't find when they searched your home very thoroughly? And she looked kind of like, oh, that's kind of, she got the implication of the question. But she kept turning up evidence, very, like bus tickets and things like that. But she found this thing in a cookbook or something, and she says, I ask people when they call me, what do you think of that document? And I would have to tell her that this was forged by you, Mrs. Payne, So I haven't called her, but I could. And during the COVID thing, I wanted to go and see her at least. And I'd like to go and talk to her. A friend of mine named Max Good has done a documentary on her, and he somehow got in her good graces. And I've seen bits of it. It looks interesting where she's giving her view. She's a very disciplined intelligence operative, though. She's very hard to crack,
Okay. And what do you make of Marina Oswald, Ken Porter?
Yeah, Ken Porter, she married this guy, and he worked for Collins Radio, which is a peculiar company that is involved in the case. It's one of these strange threads that we haven't unraveled totally, that they were a company that did a lot of work for the Defense Department, had a lot of government contracts, like they did all the radios for the Vietnam War. They did the radios for Air Force Two, which is the plane Johnson rode on. And Ken Porter worked for this company. And right after the assassination, Oswald was seen, the two Oswalds were seen around Oak Cliff, and one of them was seen at a Mexican restaurant not too far from his rooming house, in the parking lot, getting into a car. And there was a very good witness who had been a former deputy sheriff who, was a trained witness, and he took down the license number. And it turned out to be the car of a fellow who worked for Collins Radio, who turned out to be one of the closest friends of the Tippets. And this man and his wife had gone to see the Tippets right soon after the shooting. A bunch of close friends showed up at the house to console the widow. And this guy showed up, and why were they close friends with this guy who had, worked on these high security things? And then when the House Select Committee tried to interview him, he said he would talk to them, but only if he had immunity. Now, what's that about,
Wait, that was, I might have lost the thread of this, but that was Porter or whom?
Not Porter, but I'm trying to remember his name. I'm blanking on the name right
Somebody
now.
worked at that same radio company.
Yeah, he was an important person at the Collins Radio. I'm blanking on the name. I'm sorry, but the car was licensed to him, and he and his wife showed up at the Tippet home within like an hour and a half, and then when they tracked him down, obviously the Warren Commission ignored this man, but the House Select Committee wanted to interview him, and he demanded immunity. And so there's no record of any actual testimony that, let me just try to find, I should have his name at the tip of my tongue. Just a second, Collins Radio Tippet. Well, anyway, it's in my book. I go into, but this is just one of the loose ends of the case. This has never been resolved, but it's very interesting.
Right.
And
so
Armstrong claims that both Oswalds were at the theater and both were arrested. The arrest report on Oswald says he was arrested in the balcony of the Texas Theater, but the arrested was seen by a lot of witnesses and reporters, was on the ground floor, and he was dragged out. But some guy was arrested in the balcony, and the police report said that was Oswald. And then he was taken out the back door, and they let him go. And there was a civilian witness who saw this,
Right. What concerning I guess it would be about 40 to 40 hours between the time that, let me see, well, roughly, I don't know, like it wasn't 2 whole days between his arrest and his murder.
I think it was like 46 hours. As Dwight McDonald, Carl Mather was the guy, by the way, I was trying to remember. Carl Mather was Collins Radio guy who had the car. Dwight McDonald, the distinguished literary and film critic, referred to the miraculous survival of Lee Harvey Oswald in the custody of the Dallas police for 48 hours. It's about 48
I mean,
hours.
this is the thing that bothers me about, let's say, the authorities. What comes out, I think, is um, it's just egregious that they had such access, members of the press to Oswald. There was just it was a madhouse. It was like it wasn't conducive to be able to really conduct an effective investigation of anything. Really, it was just
No.
a three-ring circus. And then I mean, this whole idea that they could have access to the point where Oswald was jostled and shoved at one point, and the thing is just really unfortunate. It says, but on the part of the FBI, the idea that the hosting note would have been just disappeared screams CYA.
Yeah,
The
that's
part of
that's one
the
of the biggest. I mean, I was once arguing with some guy in the 80s about the case who was this newspaper publisher who was a diehard Warren Commission supporter, and he was getting madder and madder at me. And I mentioned the destruction of the hosting note, and he went bonkers. I mean, to him, this was an obvious smoking gun. And he said, "How do you know this?" And I said, "Well, it was testified to at a House hearing," and that kind of shut him up. But I mean, there are things like that are so flagrant. But
yeah.
yeah, I mean, in a way, when he was dragged back and forth in the halls, Oswald, I mean, I watched all that on TV. He said he got a chance to say a few things like, "I'm just a patsy. I didn't shoot anybody. No, sir." But he did do the little interview with the press in which he said a couple of important things. But um, he was interrogated for many hours. But one of the things that's really maddening is that they claim they didn't record the interrogations, and they said they didn't own a tape recorder. Well, they could have run out and bought one if they didn't have one, or they could have had a stenographer in there to take it down.
Oh, come on. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and something else though I heard was that supposedly they did in fact have a recording of Oswald that it was. I mean, you made some mention of this, but they said that they played a recording that was of a phone call to the Russian embassy or the Cuban embassy or the consulate, and supposedly that they had of Oswald. Supposedly, the Central Intelligence Agency said that the camera that they had that was surveilling the two sites, it wasn't working that day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just like
Come on.
9/11. All the cameras in the airports were not functioning that day. It's very convenient. But actually, you brought up an interesting question. If they didn't have a tape recorder at the police station, how did they manage to play that tape? I never thought about that before.
No, actually, no, maybe there's some confusion due to what I've said. No, that supposedly the Central Intelligence Agency or the FBI did have surveillance recordings
Well, they had a
of
recording. They sent it
supposed.
to Dallas by airplane that night, and they said the people interrogating Oswald listened to the tape and said it wasn't the same guy.
Okay.
But
I thought that, well, the version I got was that supposedly a few people in the Warren Commission heard it, but never wanted to make any mention of it.
I'm not sure
And
about that. Actually, I'd have to check that. But
you know,
the tape it's one of the many things in the case of sort of disappeared. Like Oswald's
sure.
Army intelligence file was destroyed, and the Secret Service destroyed a lot of their records of surveillance of people before the assassination. And I mean, that's one of the things that's hard about studying the cases. There are gaps. There are millions of pages of documents that have been released, fortunately, but there are still some that are classified after all these years now. It's been, what is it, 57 years. What kind of national security reasons are there to classify it?
Yeah.
Especially if some crazy lone nut shot the president, what's the national security justification?
Yeah, sure.
So
Sure,
we
sure.
need Biden to follow the law and release all the remaining documents. The CIA is fighting really hard against. There's a fellow named George Joannides who is the liaison between the House Select Committee and the CIA, and he didn't reveal to the House Select Committee that he had been involved with the anti-Castro Cuban groups that Oswald was supposedly involved with, and so But they've been resisting releasing their documents on him. They'd be very interesting. But what's in those documents? There's a guy named Jefferson Morley, who's a journalist who's been suing the CIA for years. So, I mean, what is it they're hiding? You know, that's one reason the public is so unbelieving of the government, if they're hiding stuff after all these years. You know, but we know the basics of the case. I think, you know.
Sure. I mean, I suppose they could argue that, well, some of the records are connected to people who are still alive, possibly who were sources.
Yeah, there are certain exceptions under the law, sources and methods, you know, like in other words,
methods, sure.
If you reveal that they had cameras outside the Cuban embassy in 1963, that would have been damaging to report that in 1963. But today, it doesn't matter, you know. And but also sources, you know, human sources, like if you say that so-and-so was leaking information out of the embassy, they might be killed if that came out. But I mean, some of these people are long dead anyway. But there are other reasons. There's some privacy issues that are considered valid, like income tax returns, for example. But you know,
that's a funny one.
Yeah,
that's kind of odd. But I mean, okay. So we look at Oswald. I mean, we can look at some of the things that came out that supposedly left about $170, which nowadays isn't much, but then it was a lot more substantial.
Mm-hmm.
He supposedly left it with Marina. He left his wedding band with Marina. You know, so you know, what do you make of that?
Well, I would say what I said before, which is that this all came from Marina and Ruth Paine. So I take it, you know, one thing I've learned in studying this case over the years is that I was a bit naive when I started. I was, you know, a journalist, but I had some illusions about things, and I've learned not to trust anything that comes out of any source, whether it's government or even, you know, witnesses are important, but you have to double check everything, and you have to look at documents, you have to verify things, you know. And so when you look into this case, most of the so-called evidence, keep using that phrase that Oswald used, came from Marina and Ruth Paine. So when Marina says he left $170 in his wedding ring, well, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but who knows besides her, you know, and I wouldn't take that as gospel. That sounds kind of peculiar, but I guess when he was arrested, he had $13 on him, which wasn't much. It was enough to get a bus to Mexico, but you know, he wasn't, we don't know exactly what he knew on the 22nd about whether Kennedy would be shot that day. One of the things that's peculiar, you know, there are a lot of things that people still try to figure out. Why wasn't he looking at the motorcade? You know, he was on the second floor in the lunchroom, apparently, which is, you know, exculpatory. He wasn't in the sixth floor window, but why would he not go outside and look at the motorcade like other people? Some people think he was, but there's, you know, people debate the photographs, but was he told by somebody to stay inside for some reason? And, you know, at what point did he realize Kennedy was going to be shot? Did he realize it later? Fraser, in your interview with him, said that he saw Oswald leave the back door, and he was kind of walking very calmly and didn't seem agitated. And that's interesting. And, you know, in the Oliver Stone film, he has an interesting shot where Oswald is kind of walking in slow motion. Suddenly he kind of realizes, wait a minute, I'm implicated in this thing. I better get...
Sure, why am I leaving, maybe?
I better get concerned here, you know, and that could have happened. That's one supposition, you know.
Okay, let's looking at Walter Brennan, Howard Brennan, rather. Not Walter Brennan, the actor.
Walter Brennan.
Howard Brennan, who claimed he saw Oswald.
He had bad eyesight, for one thing.
Well, actually, he had apparently in January 1964, he was involved in a sandblasting accident that affected his vision. But prior to that, he supposedly had very, very good sight. Oh. And he claimed that you know, I mean, the thing, what's interesting is that, you know, it's natural to think that there was a conspiracy. I mean, Lincoln was shot as part of a conspiracy. When this happened with JFK, Brennan claimed that he was started to mull it over and said, gee, maybe this is part of a larger plot. Looks like I'm the witness, and I could be in danger. My wife and my children could be in danger as well, which I think is a reasonable reaction to have. So he claimed that he could have identified Oswald, but didn't want to identify Oswald. Couldn't, maybe from the standpoint of, I don't have his exact words, but because it wasn't prudent to do so, you know?
Well, I mean, that is a human
What do you think
motive.
about that?
It's possible, but it does diminish the value of his testimony if you wouldn't identify him at the lineup, because he claimed later he was afraid. But one of the problems was, I don't know about the eyesight problem that you bring up, that it was later, but
Yeah, supposedly it happened in '64, but prior to that, his sight was
oh,
actually quite good. He was farsighted.
okay, I'll have to check that. But
Yeah.
thank you for mentioning that. But one thing, though, that people have mentioned, when he said the height, he gave the approximate height of the shooter. There's no way you could tell the height, because the person in the window would have had to have been kneeling.
I'm
You
sure.
couldn't stand. I've seen that window many times. You'd have to kneel to shoot. So you can't estimate somebody's height from the upper part of their body, really.
Sure. No, I know that, yeah. Although I think he stated that maybe about 8 minutes before the assassination, 10 minutes before, he saw him apparently at the window. I know, would it have been possible to see somebody standing up in that window? If, I mean,
Yeah, theoretically, I mean, there was a dearth. Let's say, okay, Brennan is a problematical witness, but there was a dearth of people who would have seen him. There were people who saw people in other windows, like Arnold Rowland and his wife saw some people in other windows. They saw two people, for example.
yeah,
And there it is clear, and Chief Curry said on television, and other Dallas police people said, we don't have anybody who can identify him as being in the window. I mean, the testimony would have been hard to convict somebody on in court. It was kind of shaky testimony at best.
right, okay. Right, and the whole matter of the rifle that supposedly Vincent Scalise in about 1990 said that there was, it was a constituted a positive identification on the trigger guard.
Well, there were
Have you heard that?
different rifles floating around too. If you could, the first rifle identified by Seymour Weitzman, who was a constable who saw the rifle, and he actually had worked in a sporting goods store, and he said it was a Mauser. And so they reported it as a Mauser, and Henry Wade, the DA, kept saying it was a Mauser, and then they changed it to a Mannlicher Carcano. And then there were other rifles that were seen in film footage. So there was kind of a musical chairs going on with rifles that day. So that raises further questions. But Armstrong proves conclusively to me that Oswald never had possession of that Mannlicher Carcano. Also, that's a very poor weapon, as we know. It's an old Italian military surplus weapon, and it was a defective gun that jammed and had a bad sight. And no, I mean, there are many things, very, basic things about the shooting. No marksman could duplicate Oswald's supposed feat, of shooting so fast. And there were a lot of problems with the timing of the shots. And the Zapruder film was altered. Douglas Horne proves that in his book. He was with the Assassination Records Review Board, and he proves that the Zapruder film was altered, and also that he found witnesses to the alteration of Kennedy's body, which David Lifton had written a book about. And so a lot of the evidence was altered and messed around with. So I think in a court case, Oswald would have walked, if there had been a fair trial, which would have been hard to achieve in Dallas in those days.